Carla used a paddle to push off from the shore. The canoe rocked as it swept past the rushes clustered around the lake's border and entered the clear water. The icy cold wind snapped at her exposed skin, but the jacket she brought protected her from the worst of the chill. Night creatures wailed mournfully from the forest bordering the lake. But their calls became increasingly remote as Carla steered her canoe towards the lake's center. The moon wasn't quite full, but it was close. The light created odd ripples across the water, where her paddle had disturbed the surface. Once she was far enough into the lake, the cabin's lights were a faint glow. Carla pulled her paddle back to the boat. The canoe continued to roll in the tiny waves she'd created, but it gradually stilled. The air was calm, and in the distance the water was still enough to act as a mirror for the sky. Its surface was dotted with thousands of stars. It had been years since Carla had visited the remote lake, and she was always astounded at how clear the night was without pollution or smog clouding it. She folded her hands in her lap, closed her eyes, and began to hum. The tune brought back a rush of memories from her childhood. She and her friends had sung it every time they'd gone on the lake, and she'd found it very easy to remember their faces. Clarice, Peta, and Cass, beaming and laughing, splashing water at each other. It has been so long since I last saw them, last spoke to them. Time slips by faster with each passing year. From what she'd heard, no one went on the lake anymore. She'd even passed some aged warning signs on the way to the cabin. The water wasn't safe to swim in, the signs insisted. Not that a sign was enough to deter Carla. Her family had virtually lived on the lake when she was a child. Some government official who had probably never camped under the open night sky had no right to tell her where she couldn't tread. She closed her eyes as she continued the mournful tone. The boat had been drifting away while she sat. The forest noises were now inaudible under the gentle lapping and her hums. Something scratched the boat's underside. It was so faint that Carla almost didn't hear it. She snapped her eyes open and looked across the lake. Everything was still. Probably a fish. She resumed the tune and leaned back. The air still felt cold, but she was slowly adjusting to it. She knew her fingers would be numb by the end of an hour, but she didn't intend to stay on the lake for that long. The brushing noise repeated. Carla didn't move, but her eyes snapped towards the boat's hull, the section of wood that separated her from the creature below. The noise had been too loud and too drawn out to be a fish, unless it was a very large, very slow fish. Carla wet her lips. She glanced behind herself towards the shore, where the cabin lights glittered in the dark. She was the only one on the lake that week. With water off limits, holidaying families had moved on to more inviting camps. The sound came once again, only this time was accompanied by scraping. It sounded like a long, dull claws dragging across the boat's hull. Carla's breathing was shallow. Sweat broke out across her already cold skin. She wanted to pull her legs off the wooden base, but instead, she reached for the paddle. She raised it too quickly. One end bumped the boat's side. She froze. her heart throbbing against her ribs. Knuckles white on the paddle's wooden handle. There was a perfect silence for a second. A quiet so deep, so vast, that Carla's ears rang with it. Then a solid shook the canoe. Her knock had been answered. There was no one to hear her scream, even if she had enough moisture in her mouth to make a noise. Carla dunked the paddle over the canoe's side and dragged it through the water. She managed 2 strokes towards the land before the paddle was seized. Carla gasped and tried to tug it free. She was able to pull it part way out of the water before the pressure increased, dragging it from her hands and sweeping it deep into the lake, where it would likely never be recovered. Without the paddle, she was stranded in the lake's center. Carla twisted in her seat, her eyes straining to see the movement through the dark. There! The water to her left rippled as something moved through it. The shape disappeared as it drew closer, and then a slow, horrific scraping sound ran along the underside of the boat, starting at one side, drawing below Carla, with agonizing slowness, and ending on her other side. Ripples disturbed the mirror-like water. She wanted to squeeze her eyes closed and clamp her hands over her ears to block the sound, but she knew doing that would be suicide. She hunkered low in the canoe, hand resting on the clutter of shapes at its base, as shivers ran through her. The world was quiet and still. Carla's breath plumed with every exhale, and her heart continued to thunder. Everything else was perfectly calm. She could almost think that she imagined it. Then, the unseen visitor hit the boat hard enough that Carla would have been thrown over if she'd been standing. She exhaled a grunt as she hit the wooden side. The boat twirled like a leaf in the water. Another bump came from the other side, sending her careening in the opposite direction. Carla tightened her hands on the wood below her to keep her seat. The visitor was trying to throw her out of the canoe, and she clung on to it with every ounce of strength she had possessed. The idea of being cast into an ink-black lake, her legs kicking feverishly as she fought to reach land, waiting morsel for the unseen visitor, made her heart freeze. The boat, still spiraling wildly, twirling in place, when snapped to a halt. Carla blinked back tears as she searched the rolling water for the eyes she knew was about to appear. The creature rose out of the lake. It was perfectly silent except for the water dripping off its misshapen form. The eyes, hundreds of them, all human, scattered erratically over its pulsing off-gray hide, swiveled to look at her. She thought she had recognized the pair, child-sized, the exact shade of blue that Clarice had possessed, bulging in the same way Clarice had in those last moments. They had thought they were being brave by leaving camp in the middle of the night. Their parents had been asleep. They were eager to reach the opposite shore and explore the woods before going home. Petta's paddle had been pulled out of her hands as they neared the lake's center. Confused, she leaned over the boat's edge to peer into the water. She had been pulled in. Then came scraping and rocking. Cass had tried to stand and toppled over the edge. Clarice and Carla had clung to each other in the boat's base as the bulging-eyed creature rose out of the water, reached forward, and plucked Carla's friend out of her arms. At first, she hadn't known why she'd been spared that night. It was only during the following years that a sense of purpose had come over her. Carla's fingers tightened around the wood in her hands. She lifted a harpoon, a decade of practice and the throbbing adrenaline making the barbed spear seem to weigh nothing, and turned to face her visitor. Hundreds of eyes from countless lost souls stared at her, lidless and unblinking. Carla stepped forward to claim her revenge. The end.